Imagine a patient sitting in your clinic.
Okay.
Let's say a highly successful consultant surgeon in his mid-50s. From the outside, his developmental narrative appears entirely complete.
Right. He followed the script.
Exactly. Medical school, marriage, children, prestigious hospital appointment. You would genuinely think he had reached the calm waters at the end of the journey.
You'd assume he was set for life, yeah.
But then he presents with this profound, hollow despair. An urge to just abandon his practice and a string of impulsive, really self-destructive choices.
Which is incredibly common in that demographic.
Right. So why did his boat capsize when the water seemed so still? It forces us to recognize that human development is terribly tempting to view as a pre-written story.
Oh, absolutely.
You start at page 1, you follow the plot, and eventually, you reach the end of the book. But the more you look at the reality of the human experience, the more you realize that a life is not a single finalized narrative at all.
It's an ongoing, relentless negotiation.
It really is.
It is a continuous renegotiation of balance. If we view development as a river, the error is assuming that once you navigate a difficult rapid in your youth, you are granted smooth sailing for the remainder of the journey.
Which is never the case.
Never. In reality, the river constantly bends. You encounter new topographies, hidden currents, unexpected shallows.
And the water of midlife demands an entirely different paddling technique than the white water of adolescence.
Spot on. If you apply the exact same stroke to a completely different type of current, well, the vessel overturns.
And that failure to adapt to the new current is fundamentally what brings people into our clinics.
Welcome to this deep dive.
It's great to be here.
Psychiatry is the study of how brain, mind, and experience interact and how that process can go wrong. Today, we are immersing ourselves in Chapter 6.2 of Kaplan and Sadek's comprehensive textbook of psychiatry.
A really foundational text. It is. And our focus is the pioneering work of Erik Erikson. For those of you listening, whether you are a registrar prepping for exams or a clinician refining your formulations, think of this discussion as a companion piece to your reading.
We aren't just going to list milestones.
No, exactly. Our mission is conceptual synthesis. We want to build robust mental models, clarify the underlying psychological mechanisms, and ultimately strengthen your clinical reasoning.
We're looking at how psychiatrists actually think about the lifespan.
Which requires a complete paradigm shift from classical psychoanalysis, doesn't it?
It really does. Prior to Erikson, the prevailing Freudian model was heavily front-loaded.
Everything was about early childhood.
Precisely. The theoretical consensus was that the foundational architecture of the human psyche was essentially poured and set in concrete during infancy.
Right.
Adulthood was viewed somewhat deterministically. It was largely seen as a period where the individual simply acted out those early infantile scripts.
And Erikson broke that mold entirely.
He did. He extended the lens of human development across the entire lifespan. He anchored psychological growth not just in biological drives, but inextricably within familial, societal, and historical contexts.
He moved the field away from a slightly pessimistic fixation on pathology and primal urges. He built a model that championed adaptation, resilience, and growth from the cradle all the way to the grave.
A much more optimistic view, really.
Very much so. But to understand the architecture of this massive theory, we first need to examine the architect, because Erikson's own biography is not just a footnote to his work.
No, his life was the primary laboratory for his ideas.
You cannot divorce his theoretical contributions from his deeply complex personal history. Born in Frankfurt in 1902 as Erich Homburger, his identity was profoundly complicated from the moment he entered the world.
It's a fascinating origin story.
His mother was Jewish, and his biological father, who abandoned the family before Erik's birth, was a Danish Gentile. His mother subsequently married Erik's pediatrician.
Theodor Homburger.
Right, a prominent Jewish physician in Karlsruhe. Consequently, Erik grew up within this comfortable, adoptive, middle-class Jewish household.
But consider the visceral, physical reality of this child navigating that specific cultural milieu.
He stood out.
He was a remarkably tall, blonde, blue-eyed boy. He looked entirely Nordic.
Right, so during his adolescence, he finds himself trapped in a painful liminal space.
Exactly. In his adoptive father's Jewish community and at his synagogue, he was subtly regarded as a Gentile because of his distinct physical appearance and the whispers of his biological paternity.
Yet when he went to the local German school, he was relentlessly treated as a Jew by his peers.
Because of his surname and his family's cultural practices.
He didn't fit the visual template of his home, and he didn't fit the cultural template of his school.
He was the living, breathing embodiment of role confusion long before he ever coined the term identity crisis.
It is a remarkable background for a theorist. This early, jarring experience of adoption by a kind stepfather instituted a dynamic that his biographer Robert Coles identified as a lifelong pattern.
He had a tendency to seek out and get himself adopted by influential mentors.
Paternal mentors, yeah. But more crucially, this structural alienation ignited an intensely personal, lifelong quest. He wanted to decode how any individual forges a coherent sense of self.
How do you build an identity when the external markers provided by your family and society are entirely contradictory?
Exactly. And his response to this alienation is equally fascinating. He didn't take the traditional socially sanctioned route of immediately entering university to study medicine.
Which would have been expected for the son of a prominent doctor.
Right. Instead, he embarks on what today's anxious parents might pathologize as a failure to launch.
He becomes a restless, wandering artist.
He spends his 20s trekking through the Black Forest, traveling around Italy, sketching, reading, making woodcuts.
He was actively avoiding a fixed societal role.
Yet years later, Erikson would theoretically reframe that exact period of his life, and similar periods in the lives of his patients and historical figures.
Not as aimless drifting, but as a critical mechanism called a psychosocial moratorium.
Let's unpack that term. A moratorium.
It's a delay of adult commitment. It is society granting the youth a period of grace to experiment with different roles, ideologies, and identities.
Without the immediate burden of final, irreversible consequences.
Exactly. For Erikson, this wandering wasn't a failure. It was a protective, adaptive necessity to mitigate the harshness of his acute identity crisis.
It allowed him to gather his internal ego strengths before committing to a life path.
And that concept of the moratorium completely changes how we might view a patient in their early 20s today. Someone who is struggling to commit to a career or a relationship.
It's not necessarily pathology. It might be a required incubation period.
Precisely.
But I want to trace how this wandering artist actually finds his way into the highest echelons of psychoanalysis. He is in his mid-20s, living in Vienna.
When an old school friend, Peter Bloss, invites him to teach art.
At a very specific, highly progressive grammar school. This school was established by Anna Freud and Dorothy Burlingham.
It wasn't just progressive, it was a psychoanalytically enlightened environment.
Where Herr Erik was using toys and visual exhibits to teach history and culture to children.
And within that unique ecosystem, Erikson found what he later described as a configurational affinity.
A configurational affinity, what do you mean by that?
Well, his own diverse, somewhat fragmented identity resonated perfectly with the radical, slightly deviant nature of this psychoanalytic circle.
They were outsiders studying the fringes of the human mind.
And Erikson felt an immediate kinship. He wasn't merely a teacher for long. He was quickly invited to become a candidate at the Vienna Psychoanalytic Institute.
And he entered personal analysis with Anna Freud herself.
He did.
I just have to pause on the sheer improbability of this transition. You have a man whose primary skills are carving wood and painting portraits. A man completely lacking a formal university degree or medical training.
It's quite the leap.
Suddenly, he is sitting in seminars with heavyweight, razor-sharp intellectuals like Heinz Hartmann, Ernst Kriss, and Helene Deutsch.
The imposter syndrome must have been absolutely paralyzing.
Exactly. How does he justify his presence in an intensely verbal, highly theoretical medical field?
He struggled immensely with exactly that question. He explicitly confessed his profound doubts to Anna Freud. He said he could not see how his artistic, visual inclinations could possibly fit into such abstract intellectual endeavors.
And her response?
Her response to him was a masterstroke of mentorship. She told him that his artistic eye could help make them see.
Help make them see is brilliant, because psychoanalysis at that time was heavily reliant on the talking cure.
It was entirely bound up in language, verbal free association, and intellectual interpretation.
But Anna Freud recognized that Erikson possessed a different technology of observation.
Yes, Erikson realized that visual configurations, the way a child constructs a scene with wooden blocks, or the spatial imagery within a dream actually perceive words.
Before a child has a complex vocabulary to articulate a deep-seated fear or an unconscious wish, they will build a manifestation of it in their play.
Exactly. By applying his artist's eye to clinical observation, Erikson could decode these spatial configurations.
He merged his artistic identity with his clinical identity.
He wasn't abandoning his past. He was synthesizing it into a new methodological tool.
He synthesized the fragments into a cohesive whole. And speaking of this synthesis, there is a historical detail in the text that beautifully illustrates his eventual mastery over his own identity.
The name change.
Fast forward to 1939. He has fled the rising fascist threat in Europe and emigrated to America. He is 37 years old, conducting groundbreaking research at Harvard, and he takes a profound legal step.
He changes his name.
He demotes Hamburger to a middle initial, and legal becomes Erik Erikson. He literally names himself Erik, son of Erik.
It is a breathtaking act of self-authorship. As the text notes, with characteristic creative boldness, he resolved the lifelong crisis of his absent paternity by adopting himself.
It is the ultimate clinical demonstration of his core belief. Identity is not merely an inheritance you passively receive from your parents or society.
It is an act of construction. You must synthesize your history and claim your identity for yourself.
And his arrival in America catalyzed another massive expansion of his theories. He didn't just confine himself to the clinical couch in Boston.
No, he engaged in cross-cultural anthropologic fieldwork.
He traveled to South Dakota to live with and study the Sioux Native Americans, and later observed the Yurok tribe in Northern California.
This fieldwork was a vital corrective to the insularity of classical psychoanalysis.
By stepping out of the upper-middle-class parlors of Vienna and observing indigenous communities, Erikson proved that you cannot evaluate psychological development in a vacuum.
He linked specific child-rearing practices to the economic, geographic, and historical realities of those tribes.
He demonstrated that the way a mother feeds her infant or regulates a toddler's behavior is unconsciously designed to produce the specific type of adult character required for that society's survival.
Exactly. So if a society relies on hunting on the open plains, it will cultivate a different early childhood dynamic than a society that relies on cooperative agriculture.
The psychological software is written to match the environmental hardware.
Which is a beautiful way to put it.
This ecosystem approach culminated in his 1950 masterpiece, Childhood and Society, which formally introduced his grand theory, the 8 stages of the life cycle.
But before we navigate these stages, we must unpack the engine that drives this entire developmental train. He called it the epigenetic principle.
Let's get into the epigenetic principle.
So it's borrowed directly from embryology. In the physical growth of a fetus in utero, organs develop according to a highly specific, predetermined timetable.
The heart tissue must differentiate at a precise moment. The neural tube must close at another.
Right. If the timing is disrupted, the entire organism's viability is threatened. Erikson adapted this biological blueprint to psychosocial development.
He proposed that the human personality evolves sequentially, driven by an innate, predetermined developmental timetable.
Let me offer an analogy to clarify how this cumulative process works, because it's more complex than simply climbing steps on a ladder.
Yeah, let's hear it.
Imagine human development as a vast, incredibly intricate cascade of dominoes.
Okay, dominoes.
The dominoes are all set up from birth. Elements of every developmental phase are present in the psyche from day one, but they fall in a specific, critical sequence.
Row 1 must fall to trigger row 2.
Exactly. If row 1 falls perfectly, it strikes row 2 with the right momentum, and the pattern creates a beautiful, stable structure.
That's an excellent way to conceptualize it. And to extend your analogy, if row 1 falls poorly, if the dominoes are misaligned, it doesn't necessarily mean the entire cascade stops.
Right. Row 2 will still eventually fall when its critical time arrives.
However, the energy transfer will be flawed. The resulting structure of the personality will be compromised, leaning heavily or requiring immense defensive scaffolding to remain upright.
Each stage has a critical period of ascendancy, a time when a specific psychosocial task must be confronted.
And the text is very clear on this next point. A crisis in Erikson's vocabulary is not a catastrophe. It isn't a nervous breakdown.
No, a crisis is simply a turning point. It is a developmental crossroad characterized by heightened vulnerability but also heightened potential.
It is the crucible where the ego either progresses and integrates new capacities or regresses and fixes upon pathological defenses.
Furthermore, the negotiation of any phase is never permanently finished.
This is a key point.
An individual might successfully navigate the crisis of trust in infancy, but a severe trauma or betrayal in midlife can reactivate that foundational conflict,
Forcing the psyche to renegotiate the parameters of trust all over again.
Exactly. And if the ego successfully negotiates the crisis at its critical time, it extracts something tangible. Erikson termed this a virtue or an inherent strength.
It's an active, enduring quality that the individual carries forward into the next stage.
So let's trace this epigenetic cascade from the very beginning. Let's look at the biological foundations of the self.
Stage 1, Basic trust versus basic mistrust. This encompasses birth to roughly 18 months.
The biological mechanism is profoundly oral. The infant interacts with the world primarily through the mouth.
The cultural modality, the way the infant relates to their environment, is to get. They must receive what is offered.
As dentition occurs and they develop teeth, this passive receiving becomes more active, taking and holding on.
It is crucial to understand that Erikson vigorously rejected a purely mechanical interpretation of this stage.
Oh, absolutely. The successful development of basic trust does not merely depend on the absolute quantity of food the infant receives, or on performative, superficial demonstrations of affection.
The critical variable is the quality of the maternal relationship.
It is about maternal attunement. Can the primary caretaker accurately anticipate and respond to the infant's physiological and emotional needs with consistency and continuity?
Right, because an infant's neurological system is entirely dysregulated at birth. They experience hunger or cold not just as discomfort, but as a total, annihilating existential panic.
When the mother consistently soothes that panic, the infant learns a profound lesson.
They internalize the experience of pleasure and externalize the experience of pain.
They begin to tolerate the inevitable moments of frustration because they have a baseline assurance that relief is coming.
Exactly. This consistency cultivates the very first rudimentary sense of ego identity. The infant learns that the external world is a reliable, predictable place, and simultaneously learns that their own internal urges are manageable.
When this delicate balance is achieved, the virtue that crystallizes is hope.
Hope.
In the Eriksonian framework, hope is not a passive, fluffy sentiment. It is a robust developmental achievement.
It is the foundational ego strength that allows a human being to face the future with the enduring belief that their needs can and will be met.
And Erikson was a master of linking these intimate infantile achievements to massive societal structures.
He argued that the societal institution that reflects and supports this foundational trust is religion.
Both are predicated on what he called trust, born of care. Religion, in its psychological function, provides a cosmic framework that echoes the maternal assurance that the universe is fundamentally orderly and meaningful.
Which logically propels us into stage 2, autonomy versus shame and doubt. We are now looking at the toddler years, roughly 18 months to 3 years old.
The biological locus shifts downward from the mouth to the anal sphincters and the gross musculature.
The child is learning to walk independently, to grasp, and most importantly, to control their excretory functions.
The prevailing social modalities become holding on and letting go.
This is the era of the tantrum. The word no becomes their favorite weapon.
The central psychosocial tension is the battle of wills between the child's emerging sense of agency and the parent's need to socialize them.
How much control do the adults impose?
The clinical margins here are incredibly narrow. If parents are excessively rigid or if they demand sphincter control prematurely before the child's neurology is adequately myelinated to handle it, the child experiences repeated humiliating failure.
Their burgeoning attempt to exert internal control is crushed by external force.
This breeds a deep, enduring sense of shame, the feeling of being painfully exposed and found wanting and a lasting doubt in their own capacity to navigate the world.
But the inverse is equally destructive, isn't it?
Yes. If parents are overly permissive, offering no boundaries, they fail to protect the toddler from their own lack of judgment and impulse control.
The child feels unanchored and terrified by their own uncontained power.
The parents must strike a razor-thin ratio between encouraging cooperation and allowing willfulness.
If that ratio is favorable, the child develops autonomy, the capacity to have and to hold with free will, without losing their sense of self-esteem.
And the virtue that coalesces here is will, the unbroken determination to exercise free choice and self-restraint.
Once again, Erikson maps this nursery struggle onto a macro-societal level.
He posits that the protection of this early infantile will forms the psychological bedrock for the adult societal principle of law and order.
The sense of autonomy and fairness negotiated over potty training and toy sharing serves as the preservation of a sense of justice in later political and economic life.
It grounds these lofty, abstract concepts of jurisprudence right back into the reality of the human body.
It's fascinating. As we move downstream into Stage 3 initiative versus guilt, covering ages 3 to 5, the biological mechanism expands rapidly.
The child achieves mastery over locomotor skills and language. They are running, questioning, intruding.
The social modality here is being on the make. The child becomes fiercely curious, competitive, and physically aggressive.
Psychoanalytically, this is the crucible of the Oedipal complex.
The child engages in a grandiose, fantasized contest to claim the exclusive affection of one parent, viewing the other parent as a rival to be conquered.
However, the child inevitably realizes that this ambition is impossible and physically dangerous.
They recognize the sheer discrepancy in power, and that inevitable failure of their ultimate ambition generates profound anxiety and guilt.
So what is the mechanism of resolution? How does the ego survive the collapse of its greatest fantasy?
The ego survives through repression and internalization. The child represses these forbidden incestuous wishes and internalizes the authority of the rival parent.
This internalization gives birth to the superego, the conscience.
Initially, this newly minted conscience is incredibly primitive, harsh, and uncompromising.
It acts as an internal, tyrannical regulator of their initiative, punishing them with guilt, not just for their actions, but for their very thoughts.
But here is the addictive genius of the mechanism. By renouncing the impossible Oedipal goals within the family, the child's aggressive initiative is suddenly freed up to be deployed elsewhere.
They redirect their energy outward into the wider world.
They stop competing with their father and start idolizing adult heroes, teachers, and historical figures. They attach their dreams to tangible, socially acceptable goals.
Precisely. And the virtue that emerges from successfully balancing this relentless initiative with the newly formed guilt-regulating conscience is purpose.
Purpose.
It is the courage to envision and pursue valued goals uninhibited by the paralysis of excessive guilt or the fear of infantile punishment.
This perfectly sets the stage for the transition into the school years. Stage 4 industry versus inferiority, spanning ages 5 to 13.
Now, classical Freudian theory labels this the latency period, suggesting that the biological drives essentially go to sleep until puberty.
I've always found the concept of latency slightly misleading. The psyche doesn't just switch off, does it?
The term latency is a classic misnomer if we are solely focused on the absence of overt psychosexual conflict.
Right, the biological drives might quieten down, but socially and cognitively, the demands placed on the child are immense.
If we shift the lens to ego development, this is arguably one of the most active and socially decisive periods of childhood. The energy is simply sublimated.
The child's focus shifts dramatically from the internal dynamics of the family triangle to the external demands of society.
The mechanism here is the discovery of the pleasures of production. The child must learn the specific technology of their culture.
Whether that is learning to read and write in a classroom, or learning to weave baskets or track animals in an indigenous setting.
The social modality shifts to the pleasure of work completion through steady attention and persevering diligence.
The child is actively extending their ego boundaries to include their skills. Their internal monologue becomes, I am what I can build, I am what I can learn.
And consequently, the societal matrix expands. Parents are no longer the sole arbiters of success.
Teachers, coaches, and peers become crucially important in validating the child's efforts.
If the child fails to master these cultural tools, perhaps due to a lingering sense of doubt from stage 2, or a paralyzing guilt from stage 3, or simply due to a lack of environmental support and resources, they develop a profound, enduring sense of inferiority and inadequacy.
They feel doomed to mediocrity.
However, if they are encouraged and succeed, they achieve the virtue of competence.
Erikson noted this is the stage where the child is first introduced to the division of labor and the prevailing technologic ethos of their culture.
Which brings us to the most turbulent water on the river. Stage 5, identity versus role confusion. Adolescence ranging roughly from 13 to 21 years old.
This is the stage that cemented Erikson's legacy. He fundamentally defined the modern understanding of the adolescent experience.
What exactly is the underlying mechanism when the alarm bell of puberty rings?
It is an era of massive simultaneous upheaval on multiple fronts. Physiologically, the body matures rapidly, flooding the system with new libidinous drives.
Socially, the adolescent is suddenly thrust into a world of complex peer dynamics and looming occupational choices.
The core psychological task is integration. The adolescent must gather all those earlier disparate childhood identifications, the hope, the autonomy, the initiative, the competence, and synthesize them with their new physical reality and the new social roles available to them.
It's as if they have been running various independent pieces of software for 13 years, and suddenly society demands they write a master operating system that integrates everything flawlessly.
And as the textbook poignantly notes, achieving an ego identity isn't just mathematically adding up your past experiences. It involves achieving an accrued confidence.
It is the internal settled conviction that despite all the chaotic internal changes and the shifting expectations of the world, you possess a fundamental inner sameness and continuity.
And crucially, that your internal continuity matches the meaning you have for others.
But the process of achieving that synthesis is fraught with terror. When an adolescent fails to formulate this cohesive sense of self, they fall into role confusion or acute identity diffusion.
They feel isolated, empty, and unable to make decisions.
To protect themselves against this terrifying diffusion, adolescents will deploy highly specific, primitive defenses.
They form incredibly rigid cliques, they fiercely stereotype themselves, and brutally categorize others as in or out.
They exhibit a profound intolerance of individual differences, whether that involves taste in music, clothing, or cultural background.
They are essentially clinging to a prefabricated group identity because their own individual identity is still far too fragile to bear the weight of the world. It's a survival mechanism.
It is. Erikson astutely observed that the adolescent tendency to fall in love is often not about true interpersonal intimacy at all.
It is largely a mechanism for identity clarification. The adolescent projects their own diffused, confusing self-image onto a partner, hoping to see it reflected back in a clearer, more defined form.
They are testing their own parameters.
And if they successfully navigate this chaotic rapid, if they manage to forge that master operating system, they achieve the virtue of fidelity.
Fidelity is the ability to freely pledge your loyalty to a person, an ideology, or a profession, and to sustain that loyalty despite the inevitable contradictions and flaws you will discover in those value systems.
It is the cornerstone of a mature adult identity, because logically, you cannot truly merge your life with someone else's until you know who you are.
This brings us to early adulthood, stage 6, intimacy versus isolation, ages 21 to 40.
Freud famously stated that the healthy person should be able to leben und arbeiten, to love and to work. Erikson built heavily upon this foundation, but he refined the definition of love.
In this framework, intimacy is not simply sexual proximity. It is the capacity to commit to concrete affiliations and partnerships.
Even when those commitments require significant sacrifice, compromise, and the regulation of one's own desires, it requires a profound generosity of spirit.
And here is where the epigenetic cascade becomes so clear. If you haven't successfully negotiated stage 5, if you haven't built a firm, reliable sense of identity, then the prospect of intimacy is inherently threatening.
If you don't know where your ego boundaries end, merging your life with another person feels like ego loss. It feels like self-abandonment or annihilation, and the psyche will recoil from it.
Yes. The individual who cannot tolerate that fear of ego loss retreats into deep isolation and self-absorption.
They may engage in highly stereotyped, superficial interpersonal relations, but they avoid true connection.
Erikson coined a precise, albeit somewhat clunky term for the pathological outcome of this conflict: distantiation. Distantiation is the readiness to repudiate, isolate, and actively destroy forces or people whose essence seems dangerous to one's own fragile, unintegrated identity.
It is a chilling formulation. He is arguing that the psychological bedrock of societal prejudice, racism, and persecution is rooted in individual developmental failures.
The bigot is fundamentally someone terrified of intimacy and ego loss, striking out to destroy what is different to protect a hollow self.
Now, I must raise a significant clinical and theoretical criticism of this specific stage, which the textbook acknowledges.
You are referring to the gender bias inherent in the sequence.
Exactly. Critics have quite rightly pointed out that Erikson's strict epigenetic sequence, the assertion that occupational and separate individual identity formation must be fully resolved before one can tackle intimacy, carries a distinct mid-century male bias.
For many women, and indeed for many men, identity formation is deeply, inextricably intertwined with the formation of intimate attachments.
The sequence is not universally linear. Intimacy and identity often co-evolve concurrently.
It is a vital caveat, especially when formulating cases for patients whose cultural or personal narratives prioritize community and relationship over solitary individuation.
Moving further into adulthood, we hit stage 7, generativity versus stagnation, ages 40 to 60.
Now, colloquially, people often reduce generativity to simply having and raising children. But Erikson's conception was vastly more expansive than mere biological reproduction.
Generativity is the protective, guiding concern for all subsequent generations and for social institutions that sustain them.
It encompasses professional productivity, artistic creativity, and civic engagement.
The mature individual in midlife feels a profound psychological need to be needed. They must broaden their investment of ego energy beyond the intimate diet of their marriage or their immediate family.
Extending it outwards to include their community, their organization, and society as a whole. The virtue that coalesces during this stage is care.
The text offers a devastating critique of what occurs when this stage fails. If an individual cannot develop true generativity, they settle for pseudo-engagement.
Consider the senior partner at a law firm who is technically brilliant at billing hours, but who absolutely refuses to mentor junior associates or contribute to the ethical standards of the profession.
They eschew any larger responsibility. This inevitably leads to a pervasive sense of personal stagnation and internal deadness, which they then attempt to mask with frantic escapisms.
Substance abuse, reckless midlife crises, or compulsive infidelities.
And the implications of this failure are deeply societal. When the middle-aged demographic, the individuals who are structurally positioned to lead, manage, and care for our institutions, fail in their generativity, those institutions become sick.
They become withered, toxic, or actively destructive. The stagnation at the top spreads a psychosocial rot throughout the organization.
Erikson astutely observed that this type of widespread institutional sickness, driven by the personal stagnation of its leaders, has become a defining pathology of modernity.
It is the stark difference between a manager who solely extracts value to hit a quarterly target and a true leader who actively cultivates an ecosystem that will thrive long after they have retired.
Which brings us to the final sweeping bend of the river. Stage 8, integrity versus despair, from roughly 60 years of age until death.
The developmental task here is not about external production, but internal reconciliation.
The primary mechanism is reflection and acceptance. Integrity, in Erikson's specific usage, is the hard-won acceptance of one's one and only life cycle.
And of the people who have become significant to it as something that absolutely had to be and which permitted no substitutions.
It involves relinquishing the agonizing retrospective wish that circumstances had been different or that one had made different choices. It is the ultimate assumption of responsibility for one's own narrative.
You look back at the specific river you navigated, the rapids, the mistakes, the triumphs, and you make peace with the route.
The virtue that emerges from this profound acceptance is wisdom. It is a detached yet intensely active concern with life itself.
And crucially, achieving this integrity allows the individual to tolerate the encroaching proximity of death without terror.
Conversely, despair is the feeling that time is now too terribly short to attempt alternate roads to integrity.
The individual feels trapped in a life they cannot accept. This internal despair often manifests externally as a profound, bitter disgust with the world, with younger generations, or with institutions.
But that outward disgust is merely a defensive mask covering an absolute, paralyzing terror of death.
And Erikson closes his theoretical loop brilliantly by linking this final stage of the elderly back to the very first stage of the infant.
He famously wrote, "Healthy children will not fear life if their elders have integrity enough not to fear death."
It is one of the most elegant, profound sentences in the entire psychiatric literature.
The cycle connects. The integrity and wisdom of the elders provide the psychological and environmental bedrock for the basic trust of the infants. It is a closed, interdependent loop of psychosocial reliance across generations.
So we have delineated this elegant 8-stage epigenetic cascade.
But returning to our clinical reality, as psychiatrists, we rarely see patients when the dominoes have fallen perfectly. We see them when the structure is leaning dangerously or collapsing.
Right. If development follows the sequential timetable, how does Erikson's model help us formulate the severe, acute psychiatric presentations we encounter on the wards?
This is where Erikson's framework transforms from abstract theory into a vital dynamic clinical tool. He fundamentally shifted the diagnostic lens.
He did not view severe psychiatric pathologies purely as static diseases subject solely to biological categorization.
He viewed symptoms as aggravated developmental crises. When a patient presents in acute distress, they are displaying a derailed negotiation of a specific life task.
Their symptoms are the language of arrested psychosocial development.
Let's put this into practice and trace specific pathologies back to specific stage failures. Consider a patient presenting with profound, treatment-resistant depression characterized by an overarching feeling of complete internal emptiness.
Or a patient with severe, intractable substance use disorder. Or perhaps a patient demonstrating the profound reality break and withdrawal of schizophrenia.
Where does an Eriksonian clinician look for the point of derailment?
We must look back to the foundational bedrock. Stage 1, trust versus mistrust. These severe presentations often reflect profound disturbances in the earliest dyadic relationships.
The ego failed to integrate basic trust or crystallize the virtue of hope.
The crushing emptiness of certain depressive presentations is conceptualized as an outgrowth of deep oral pessimism, a fundamental belief that the world is barren.
Severe addictions are formulated as a compulsive, tragic attempt to fulfill an unmet need for oral incorporation. The patient is constantly trying to get from a substance what was never reliably provided by the early environment.
The profound withdrawal of schizophrenia can be viewed as the ultimate retreat from a world deemed entirely untrustworthy.
Let's look at a different presentation. Consider the patient admitted with severe paranoia, crippled by rigid, unyielding fears of persecution.
Or on the personality disorder spectrum, consider the patient with severe obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. They're stingy, maddeningly inflexible, obsessed with rules, and constantly trying to control the behavior of everyone around them.
That clinical picture points directly to stage 2, autonomy versus shame and doubt. The paranoia is formulated as the toxic, projected residue of fundamental mistrust, heavily compounded by unresolved doubt regarding autonomy.
The patient projects their own unacceptable urges onto others.
The OCPD presentation, the rigid perfectionism, the hoarding, the ritualistic behavior, stems from a developmental fixation on the conflicting tendencies to hold on and let go.
It represents the triumph of doubt over true autonomy. The patient operates under the tyranny of a primitively harsh, punitive conscience developed during those early battles for control.
It makes complete sense dynamically. It is a massive overcorrection of control precisely because their core ego feels utterly out of control.
Now, what if the derailment happens in stage 3, initiative versus guilt, the Oedipal stage? How does that unresolved conflict manifest clinically?
When the ego is crushed by the unresolved conflict between the aggressive drive for conquest and the anticipated terrifying weight of punishment, it often retreats into somatic expression.
We see this in conversion disorders, where an unbearable psychological conflict is converted into a physical symptom, like a sudden paralysis or blindness.
We see it in severe phobias or massive inhibitions, where the patient simply cannot initiate action.
Alternatively, they might overcompensate for their massive unconscious guilt by driving themselves relentlessly, becoming workaholics until their body breaks down with severe psychosomatic symptoms.
The body bears the brunt of the punishing superego. In stage 4, industry versus inferiority. The pathology here seems less likely to land someone in an acute inpatient unit, but perhaps more likely to lead to chronic, low-grade misery in outpatient care.
Exactly. The pathology of stage 4 is subtle but highly pervasive. It manifests as a conformist immersion into the world of production.
The individual's creativity is completely stifled. They have no internal locus of value, so their entire identity becomes subsumed under their occupational role.
They become defensively, obsessively preoccupied with status, titles, and compensation as a fragile shield to ward off a deep-seated, terrifying conviction of their own inferiority and inadequacy.
They are the archetypal corporate drone, hiding a terrified child who believes they are simply not good enough.
We touched on stage 5, identity failure, during our earlier discussion, but to summarize its clinical presentation, it manifests as acute identity diffusion.
In the clinic, we might see this as severe delinquency, sudden and chaotic shifts in value systems, complex gender-related identity crises.
Or even borderline psychotic episodes where the ego simply fragments under the pressure of integrating internal drives with external demands.
We also mapped intimacy failure in stage 6, leading to distantiation and the pathology of prejudice.
Finally, generativity failure in stage 7 drives the midlife crises, premature invalidism, and the destructive pseudo-engagement that rots institutions from the inside out.
It provides a remarkably comprehensive diagnostic map that contextualizes the symptom within the lifespan. But implementing this map requires a fundamentally different kind of listening from the clinician.
It's not just ticking off criteria in the DSM. Erikson argued that to truly understand the meaning of a patient's event or symptom, the clinician must view it simultaneously through a multidimensional lens.
He called this framework the fourfold configuration of meaning. Let's break down these 4 lenses.
First, the clinician must ascertain the specific stage of the patient's life cycle. What is the age-appropriate developmental task they are currently facing?
Are they a young adult struggling with intimacy or an elder grappling with despair?
Second, we must examine the patient's personal life history. What is their specific epigenetic track record? How did they negotiate previous crises?
Third, the patient's culture. And fourth, the history of that specific culture.
And those last two lenses are where traditional psychiatry and psychoanalysis have historically had massive blind spots.
Erikson warned that the entire foundational terroir of psychotherapy, its underlying assumptions, its literature, its very definition of health, has been overwhelmingly implicitly Western.
We hold unexamined dogmas about what constitutes psychological maturity, what healthy family separation looks like, or what gender roles should be, and we blithely assume these are universally applicable human truths.
They are not. They are specific cultural constructs.
Erikson was highly critical of this cultural myopia. He wasn't advocating for complete moral relativism, but he argued forcefully for an understanding of a continuum of psychic universals.
Take, for instance, the psychiatric concept of separation individuation. Western therapeutic models often idolize maximum separation as the absolute pinnacle of mental health.
Moving out at 18, cutting emotional dependencies, achieving total financial independence.
But many Eastern or collectivist cultures require far less separation and far more interdependence to function maturely and successfully. Both are valid, adaptive positions on the human continuum.
The textbook provides a brilliant, tangible example of this cultural relativity regarding how we unconsciously absorb gender ideals from childhood.
Look at the artistic legacy of Western culture. Look at classical Greek or Roman sculpture. The idealized male form is hard, heavily muscled, with zero body fat.
It emphasizes impenetrable boundaries and maximum differentiation. We absorb that aesthetic as a psychological norm.
And Erikson contrasts that sharply with the sculpted representations of Hindu deities or the Buddha. In those traditions, the divine idealized forms, even the male figures, are noticeably softer, suppler, and nearer to the female form.
They emphasize fluidity and integration rather than hard boundaries. A clinician steeped only in Western ideals who insists that maximum sexual and emotional differentiation is the only metric of a healthy identity is blinding themselves to the vast adaptive continuum of human experience.
Erikson demands that therapists explicitly recognize their own cultural relativity, so we do not inadvertently pathologize a patient merely because they are adhering to a different valid cultural norm.
And the beauty of Erikson's fourfold configuration is that he didn't just apply it to patients in a clinical setting, he applied it to historical figures on a macro scale.
He essentially invented modern psychobiography. He wrote Pulitzer Prize-winning analyses of Martin Luther and Mahatma Gandhi, using their lives to explain how individual psychological crises intersect with, and sometimes alter, historical moments.
Take his analysis of young Martin Luther. Luther is in the monastery choir, deeply conflicted, and he falls to the floor in a fit, screaming, "I am not."
Ich bin's nicht, yes. Erikson diagnosed that historical moment as Luther's acute, crushing identity crisis.
Luther was fatally, structurally overcommitted to a role in Orthodox, obedient Catholic priest that authentically violated his internal reality.
He could not integrate his intense personal relationship with God into the rigid institutional role provided by the Church. His ego fractured under the pressure.
But the genius of Erikson's analysis is showing how Luther resolved that personal crisis. He didn't just go to therapy and adapt to the Church. He forged a completely new ideology.
He defied the Pope, translated the Bible, and nailed his 95 Theses to the door.
And in doing so, his personal psychological survival mechanism ended up providing a new ideological orientation that supported an entire emerging generation of Europeans who were suffering from a collective historical identity crisis.
He solved his own identity diffusion and simultaneously solved a historical one.
Ideology, in Erikson's framework, is the unconscious tendency to create a world image convincing enough to support both individual and collective identity.
He saw a similar macro-level dynamic in Gandhi, but occurring at a later stage of the epigenetic timetable. Luther is the ultimate case study of youth and stage 5 identity. Gandhi is the ultimate study of middle age and stage 7 generativity.
Gandhi was in his midlife transition when he invented satyagraha, the strategy of passive resistance, or truth force. He realized his true vocation.
He figured out, as the developmental task demands, what he cares for and what he will take care of. He didn't just care for his immediate family, he took profound generative responsibility for the entire Indian nation.
That is the ultimate historical expression of the virtue of care.
So, synthesizing all of this theory, what does this actually mean for the clinician sitting in the consultation room with a patient today? How does an Eriksonian therapist conduct the therapeutic encounter differently than a classical Freudian?
The primary directive for an Eriksonian therapist is to strictly avoid a conceptual trap he termed originology.
Originology, it's a great term. How did he define it?
Originology is the problematic, often reductionist habit in classical psychoanalytic thinking of distilling every current human situation, conflict, or symptom down to a direct analogy with its earliest infantile precursor.
For instance, if a 40-year-old patient presents with severe anxiety regarding a conflict with their corporate boss, a practitioner trapped in originology would immediately bypass the current workplace dynamics and reduce the problem entirely to an unresolved Oedipal conflict with the patient's father at age 3.
They treat the present life of the patient merely as a shadow play of their infancy. Erikson argued that while those early childhood dynamics are undeniably influential, the clinician must fiercely respect and pay attention to the contemporary, adult conflicts the ego is facing in the present world.
The 40-year-old struggle with generativity and workplace ethics is real and valid in its own right, not just a repetition of the nursery.
Exactly. The therapist must address the present roadblock. To discern what that roadblock is, Erikson advocated for a stance of disciplined subjectivity combined with free-floating attention.
The therapist listens to the patient's material, their free associations, their memories, their dreams, their daily frustrations, without immediately forcing a premature theoretical interpretation onto it.
The therapist trusts the innate natural synthesizing function of the ego. Eventually, if the therapist remains open, the patient's associations and the therapist's own internal clinical ruminations will naturally converge upon a central unitary theme.
A theme that seamlessly connects their early childhood vulnerabilities, their current presenting symptom, their immediate relationship with the therapist, and their ongoing struggles in love and work.
And regarding that relationship with the therapist, Erikson made a vital departure from classical technique. Pure classical analysis relies heavily on the blank screen.
The therapist remains an opaque mirror, solely so the patient can project their past relationships onto them, the transference.
Erikson acknowledged the reality of transference, but he actively advocated for the real relationship in the room.
He believed that the therapist is fundamentally a real, new person interacting with the patient in their present stage of life. The interaction is not purely a ghost of the past.
Therefore, the therapist has an active role. Sometimes the therapist must step out of the shadows to educate, to clarify reality, or to actively guide.
The therapeutic contract in this framework is a deeply collaborative mutual endeavor. And fundamentally, it is driven by a profound underlying optimism.
It is the belief that natural epigenetic forces constantly propel the individual forward toward growth. The goal of therapy is not to magically cure the patient so they never face another crisis. Crises are the inevitable engine of development.
The goal is to help the patient emerge from their current crisis with an increased sense of inner unity, better judgment, and the specific virtue required for that stage. You are actively helping them get their boat righted and back into the flow of the current.
Absolutely.
Let's pause here and do some clinical rounding. We have covered a vast conceptual landscape, so let's test these mental models. Listeners, I'm going to frame a theoretical question or clinical scenario based strictly on the text. I'll give you a second to think, and our expert will dissect the mechanism and provide the correct rationale.
Sounds good?
Question 1. According to Erikson's epigenetic principle, how do psychosocial stages develop over time? I'll give you the second.
So, elements of every phase are present in the psyche from birth, but they unfold according to a predetermined timetable. Each phase has a critical period of ascendancy where it must be negotiated. They do not spontaneously generate out of nowhere. They develop sequentially, heavily dependent on the proper resolution of the preceding stages.
Brilliant. Question 2. Consider a patient admitted to the ward presenting with profound paranoid delusions and fears of persecution. In an Eriksonian framework, this patient is likely struggling with the toxic residue of which unresolved developmental conflict. Take a moment.
The answer is stage 2, autonomy versus shame and doubt. The clinical formulation views paranoia as the pathological projection of unresolved mistrust combined with severe, crippling doubt regarding their own autonomy and the control of their impulses.
Question 3. What did Erikson mean when he warned clinicians against the practice of originology? Think about that for a second.
Yeah, originology is the problematic reductionist habit of tracing every current adult psychosocial conflict or psychiatric symptom back to an analogy with its earliest infantile precursor, thereby completely ignoring the valid contemporary tasks and stressors the ego is facing in the present environment.
Question 4. What is the specific core virtue that coalesces during the successful negotiation of the generativity versus stagnation stage at midlife?
The answer is care. It is defined as the widening protective concern for all subsequent generations and for the maintenance of social institutions, moving the individual beyond mere self-absorption or occupational pseudo-engagement.
Question 5. To avoid cultural myopia, Erikson argued that the meaning of any patient's life event must be understood through a four-fold configuration. What are the four specific lenses of this configuration? I'll give you a second.
The clinician must examine the stage of the patient's life cycle, the patient's personal life history, the patient's specific culture, and the broader history of that culture.
Question 6. How did Erikson developmentally formulate the pathology of extreme prejudice, racism, and persecution arising in early adulthood? Take a moment.
He conceptualized it as a manifestation of distantiation. This is the severe pathologic outcome of stage 6, intimacy versus isolation. It is the readiness to aggressively isolate, repudiate, or destroy individuals or forces whose essence seems dangerous to the patient's own fragile, unintegrated ego identity.
Excellent formulations. I highly direct everyone listening to return to Chapter 6.2 for further reading. The depth and nuance in the original text, particularly his later writings on vital involvement in old age, are truly foundational for any psychiatric practice.
To distill the essence of our deep dive today, human psychological development is not front-loaded. It spans the entire lifespan. Every developmental stage is a continuous negotiation of a specific psychosocial tension, not a mechanical problem to be permanently fixed.
Identity formation reaches its critical crescendo in adolescence, but remains fluid and dynamic thereafter. Furthermore, a patient's social, cultural, and historical contexts are inseparable from their psychological growth.
Ultimately, psychiatric distress must be reframed not simply as static pathology, but as an active difficulty in negotiating these fundamental life tasks.
We are always negotiating the river. And I want to leave you with one final, provocative thought regarding the current state of the water. Erikson explicitly showed us that our psychological growth, the very architecture of our identity, is entirely dependent on our continuous physical interaction with our society and our cultural tools.
Today, our culture is undergoing rapid, unprecedented, and often profoundly isolating technological shifts.
The ways we connect, the ways we work, and the ways we seek intimacy have been massively digitized and removed from the physical realm. How might these profound systemic changes to our societal ecosystem be quietly, invisibly rewiring the epigenetic timetable of our own identities? Are we inadvertently engineering a new historical era of mass role confusion? Something for you to mull over on your next ward round. Here are the details of this episode.
Erik Erikson, byline. A life is not a single story. It is a series of developmental negotiations across time.